and welcome to the Justin Center Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper. Thank you so much for joining me once again on the program today. And just to give you all a reminder, the Justin Center as an organization is supported by donors. So we would ask you to consider becoming a contributor to us and the things that we do through Justin Center. This is what I rely on as my primary source of income. So, and there are all sorts of other things that we need to do with the money, including pay for some editing costs for a number of books and really exciting projects we have coming in the future. So we are looking for some more donors to continue doing the things that we do. So if you want to contribute, if you've enjoyed and appreciated the work that we do and want to see it continue and to see us expand in different ways, go to justincenter.org and go to the donate page there and you can help us out. Now, I also have an exciting announcement this week. Through our Widener Institute, we release seminars. Some of them are live recorded seminars, live courses as well as some pre-recorded courses to offer for sale. We have the latest of these, which is a course on the proper distinction between law and gospel. So Pastor Louis Polzin, who has joined me plenty of times on the program, he's on our board, he's our fellow of practical theology. He has taught a lay level, very practical course on the proper distinction between law and gospel. So he goes through all of CFW Walther's 25 theses on the subject and explains each of them. So there's a lot of great content there. It's quite a bit for the amount of money that you're going to be paying for it. You're going to get a lot of really great content. And yes, it's not free. It does cost something to be able to take our courses. It's $50 though for 25 lessons. So it's pretty comprehensive in what you're getting for that price. So go to justincenter.org, go to our Widener Institute page there, and you can purchase that. I'm really excited about this one, and I think you don't want to miss out. So anyway, we are going to jump into the topic of the program today. I got quite a bit of positive feedback about our discussion of Carl Trueman's book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. And I hadn't gotten through all that I wanted to discuss in that book. And so I wanted to do a second program going through some of that material. I think it's a really important topic. If you haven't watched the first one or listened to the first podcast, I would recommend going through that first before listening to this. Of course, you can still listen to this if you haven't listened to the first one, but it may help to give you some context to get some of the background. But just for the brief of it, Carl Trueman, who's a professor at Grove City College, it was a former professor at Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia. He has written this book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, to explain basically where we got to where we are today as a culture and society in terms of how we understand the self. What he refers to as expressive individualism, the general idea of seeing ourselves as these kind of atomized individualistic selves and those who need to give ourselves over to kind of our own self-expression. And so it's important for our purposes as a theology podcast, because it really does shape how everyone in the culture views themselves. It has a profound impact on our theology, how we do theology, how we look at theology, how we view ourselves in the church. And so as a theologian, I recognize that there are many areas of life that I'm not equipped to deal with. Right? You're not going to hear me give talks on economics or healthcare or all sorts of other things. It's just not my calling. It's the calling of other people as God has gifted them to work in those particular areas. But there are some, especially when it comes to philosophy and broader ideology, there are a lot of areas where I think the church does need to speak up, and we need to understand as a church what's happened in our culture and where we are. We need to understand the culture that we're speaking to. We need to understand the philosophical background and shifts that have occurred that have led us to where we are. And it also helps us to evaluate ourselves and evaluate our own approaches to the world, because the things that Trueman outlines in this book are going to impact every single one of us. There's not one of us that is going to be, devoid of this. I don't care how, #trad you are, you're affected by these philosophical movements. Like, we're all affected by our cultural moment. And, in some ways, I think that even the entire trad movement can be said to really be a very modern thing, at least in the way that it's approached, because all the hashtag trad people are also the same ones who are constantly like posting memes just insulting all sorts of other people, which would have been like an abhorrent thing to do in previous traditional cultures, to speak to people in the way that they do, especially authority figures or anyone older than them. It's anyway, that's a whole other discussion. But the point is, we're all affected by this, so that's why this is really essential that we dive into. I've also mentioned in the last program that people have asked me some questions about this as well, that I am working on a book on truth, goodness, and beauty. So that work it's almost halfway done at this point. I've been writing for like 2 weeks, and it's just kind of been coming out. It's one of these things that it's like, it's all stuff that's been in my head that I've just needed to get out, I guess, because it's come pretty quickly as I've written this. Now, of course, it's a first draft and it may be a mess, but at least it's all something's getting, vomited on the page. So we'll see how that goes. But essentially what I'm trying to do is trace these three transcendentals of truth, goodness, and beauty, and demonstrate what those things were in classical thoughts, both classical Greek thought into the Christian world, and of course a Christian approach to these things, and then kind of what shifted in the modern era, and how we lost those things, and specifically how truth, goodness, and beauty kind of got divorced from each other. And it's my contention that as it's funny because I see, you see a lot of the kind of new atheist types really criticizing the culture today and where progressivism has gone today. And my contention is just that secularism and materialism is just completely incapable of addressing these societal issues. It really is. And I think that the place where we are today in many ways with relativism and all of its various manifestations is the inevitable conclusion of the Enlightenment project. So there's my thesis, the short of it there, but I'm going to delve more into that in this particular book. So, this is why I'm interested in Trueman's book, because I'm thinking through these issues myself and writing some things on them. Now, my book is going to be very different from Trueman's in that what Trueman does is speak about, well, the modern self. I mean, he deals not so much with classical philosophy and the decline of classical philosophy, which is really where I'm going to be centering my arguments. So there are pieces to this story that Trueman doesn't capture, and I'm trying to capture some of those pieces. But of course, my book will certainly not have all the pieces either. I mean, that's how ideology and culture forms. It's very multifaceted. There are so many elements to the culture getting to where it is. I mean, there's so much that shapes our world. There's just no easy historical narrative or easy kind of scapegoat to blame, which is what we largely want to do, and it would make things a heck of a lot easier if we could do that, or just trace one idea down through the ages and say, hey, this is the cause of all of our problems. But unfortunately, history is a lot messier than that, so we can't do it so easily. So that's my background there, and I'm going to jump into the topic for today, or get into some further things today. So what I talked about last time, I started going through, I mentioned this, that Trueman's book deals largely with two particular figures. He's interacting with the research of Charles Taylor and Philip Rieff. Now, both of these individuals have dealt with different elements of the modern world and the modern view of self that are extremely helpful and very insightful. I went through a large part of Charles Taylor. I talked about the idea of the social imaginary, the mimesis and poiesis. I talked about different aspects of identity that he has there. One more thing that I wanted to just mention here in Charles Taylor before I jump into some of the things in Rieff, and I think Rieff is extremely helpful. Rieff has written quite a bit. So there are a number of books that Trueman is drawing on here, and he's got a great summary of Rieff's work. But the one thing I want to mention in Charles Taylor is he speaks about these two great reversals. Reversals from outward institutions becoming kind of inward things, or being determined by that which is internal to the self. And so the first is this. He says, and this is a quote here, "Therapy ceases to serve the purpose of socializing an individual. Instead, it seeks to protect the individual from the kind of harmful neuroses that society itself creates through its smothering of the individual's ability to simply be herself." So if you think about therapy, and we could certainly speak about our culture as a therapeutic culture. I mean, so many, sociologists have use that kind of language. We can think of, Christian Smith's moralistic therapeutic deism when we're talking about the church and the place of religion in people's lives today, is that it is this, God is there for therapeutic purposes only, which is why we don't like talk of wrath or condemnation or judgment or law at all. It just doesn't fit our modern sensibilities very well. So we want a deity that just affirms us as we are. But that's nothing new either. It's not like that's just modern. I mean, Jeremiah deals with this constantly with these, if you read the book of Jeremiah, there are these false prophets saying, oh, peace, peace, where there is no peace. It's this refrain that Jeremiah has over and over again. And, I always go back to the book of Jeremiah because I think he speaks so well to our culture, is all of these people are just preaching that, oh, everything's fine. God's just going to bless you and give you whatever you want. Don't worry. There's no judgment coming. And you're fine as you are. Your Baal worship is great. It's all of the things that we're facing in our culture today is we want this deity who just affirms what we do. It affirms our internal state and our internal desires and says everything's going to be great. And that may be therapeutic and may make us feel good in the short term, but it's not true. So that's essentially what we're talking about here with this therapeutic view of the faith. But so what Taylor here, who's being summarized by Trueman, what he's saying is, in the past, therapy was understood to be the purpose of, done for the purpose of, you have, as an individual, you maybe have a problem, and your problem makes it very difficult for you to get along in society for one reason or another. And so you go to therapy to try to deal with that. Say you have like intense social anxiety to the point that you don't want to leave your house. You don't want to communicate with anyone. Now, it is not beneficial or helpful to you to have such social anxiety and never get help for it. So one of the things that therapy should do, if it's done properly and done well, is to help the individual kind of figure out what are those internalized fears that you have. How can we work through those things? I'm no psychologist, but how can we work through these things? How can we get you to the point that you do feel comfortable to confront those fears and those kind of things that you're working with, right? So that's just one example of, say, things that make your life difficult or make your fitting into society difficult. But that has kind of shifted to where now the purpose of therapy has shifted from helping you to fit into broader society instead, which is it's protective of the individual from, he says here, the kind of harmful neuroses that society itself creates. So society becomes the problem rather than the individual. So this goes back to a lot of the ideas that are prominent in Romanticism, that to truly be yourself, right, to be the authentic self, we need to escape from the pressures that society puts on us. And the authentic self is the one who connects just with their inner self and goes into nature. Right? So this is the kind of what you find in the Transcendentalists, for example. And I mentioned last time, existentialism largely does this. If you look at the writings of Heidegger, but Sartre and others as well, speak about this kind of inauthentic existence. So inauthentic existence is really living according to the social standards that you're given, but authentic existence is just living according to your real innermost desires. So the idea is that the real self is the inner self. The real self is not your social involvement or involvement in broader culture, but it's your internalized feelings. And so what happens is, for the psychologist or the therapist in this more recent perspective, is they're saying, well, you're not the problem, society's the problem. Everyone else is wrong, and you just need to learn to be yourself. So that is very much behind a lot of the ideas today about the self. And this is the reason why when someone disagrees with your decision, say to be who you are, right? Not getting into specifics here, but you know what I'm talking about. So if you say, I need to change these elements about myself and I'm not really who I appear to be on the outside, I'm something completely different on the inside, it's not okay enough for people to just kind of leave you alone, right? It's not enough for you to be able to just do whatever you want legally and declare who you are, whoever you want, without people bugging you about it. That's not enough. you need to be affirmed by the outside world. You need other people to explicitly affirm you and affirm who you are, and it is a personal offense if they don't affirm whoever you say that you may be, or whatever you may be, or whatever desires internally you may have that you determine are definitional to who you are, right? So then it becomes an offense, because now you're the outside world, right? You're the person who disagrees. You're the enemy, and it's your job to affirm me in my internal state and whoever I am. So this happens not just with therapy, that this happens with medicine as well. And I think you see this a lot with, for example, disability studies today. So if you look at a lot of the critical theory that specifically is related to questions of ability, in the past it was seen that, say, if you're deaf, that it's a disability, right? That it means that you have all of the parts and pieces that are there in your body so that your ears have a particular function. Now, a disability is when developmentally something happens to block the proper functioning of the ears, so that it is indeed a disability. They're not working the way that they're supposed to. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that a deaf person their life doesn't matter as much as someone who's not deaf, or it doesn't mean that the quality of life of a deaf person is necessarily any worse. You could have people who are deaf who have a much better life than people who hear, of course. So it's not like that, is determinative of the entire quality of their life. But it is to say that it is a real disability. There's something that's actually wrong, right? But with a lot of the kind of critical theory as applied to the studies in, speaking about ableism and all of these kind of things, nowadays it's for those individuals, there is nothing actually wrong. It's just that they're different and there's no problem. They just have ears that don't happen to hear, but they're not necessarily supposed to hear because there's no meaning or purpose in anything, including your body parts. So, which, goes back to this kind of teleological approach to nature, this idea that there are actually ends, there are purposes or goals in the creation of things. They actually have meaning and function and purpose beyond that which we just impose on it internally. So, the idea is, well, ears aren't for hearing necessarily. They can be if you're a person who is hearing abled, but if you're not hearing abled, then they're not for that. That just is what it is. Now, with that, it has a lot of harm in so many ways, but what it does is it does things like, well, it means that, well, should doctors now not try to find ways to improve hearing, because that's prejudice. It's prejudice. It's privileging one group of people over another. It's wrong, right? So, or if you're a deaf person who decides to have cochlear implant or whatever to cure that or to deal with that, now are you kind of betraying who you are? Are you giving into the lie that to be hearing abled is necessarily a better thing than not to be able to hear, right? In this, when we see this kind of language or these kinds of discussions, it is this same general idea that there can never really be anything wrong with you or who you are, psychologically, naturally, whatever. But the problem is with everyone else. It's a problem with the outside world. Now, I don't say this as somebody who has no problems. Hey, I've seen psychologists. I'm diagnosed with OCD. I've got plenty of neuroses. I do, and I've worked through a lot of them, and I've got, neuroses of, because, OCD works with, you've got anxiety. And so you have these kind of obsessions, you count things and get thoughts that are stuck in your head or whatever. Like I've dealt with all of this, and thankfully, I recognize that that's not proper functioning, and that the things that were going on and still go on, like this is just a thing that I deal with, but the things that go on in my head are not actually beneficial for my proper functioning in society or just doing things well in life. So I don't just tell everyone else that, hey, this is what I do and you need to get used to it regardless of what hurts you or doesn't, or whatever gets in your way. No, I need to learn to be a functioning human in society, and I need to deal with those issues. And it's not about being insensitive to others with their issues. we need to be very sensitive, certainly, in caring about people and whatever issues they may have. But the thing is, just because you do something, or just because you have an internal desire, or just because you have an internal thought process, does not make it okay. In therapy is to help you through what are problematic ideas and problematic thoughts and things that are harmful to your general well-being and the general well-being of society. And it's okay to like admit those problems. But what we've done now is taken that and reversed it. So the problem is never you. The problem is always everyone else. And so if an individual, for example, thinks that they should be disabled, right? They think they should be, even though they're not. Like they think they should be missing a limb. And, this is a psychological phenomenon that's real. And I don't think we want to, negate the reality of this, because we have plenty of examples of this as a real phenomenon where people think that they should be disabled for whatever reason. And, the question is, what do we do? If somebody feels like they shouldn't have an arm, do we say, well, your internal psychological state, because you decided that thing, that's the most important thing. Therefore, let's remove your arm that is properly functioning and healthy. Is that the proper response? Or is the proper response to say, well, let's look at some of your kind of underlying issues that lead to this? Like clearly there are a lot of mental processes, there are thoughts, there are false thoughts, there's some kind of trauma probably behind the thinking. So let's deal with that and help you to come to accept what is good, that you have this natural, properly functioning arm, and you have two of them. So, this is just a radical shift in how we do therapy. And because of expressive individualism, that there is just this emphasis on the individual, their own experience, their own desires as being the core of what is truly good, if there is such a thing as good at all, which becomes purely internalized. If that's the case, then we just have to help people to be authentic. And authenticity becomes this general common good. And I've talked about authenticity last time and had some interesting responses to that as well. Okay. So the second thing that Taylor discusses in these reversals is this: outward institutions become, in effect, the servants of the individual and her sense of inner well-being. Institutions cease to be places for the formation of individuals via their schooling and the various practices and disciplines that allow them to take their place in society. Instead, they become platforms for performance, where individuals are allowed to be their authentic selves precisely because they are able to give expression to who they are inside. So every society has institutions, and I mentioned this last time, that when society ceases to have institutions, or when we think we're free from institutions, then we don't actually escape them. What we do is just create alternative institutions. I mentioned this with subcultures, and I mentioned that I was part of the punk rock subculture, and I said, hey, the entire idea behind punk rock is like society is messed up. We have our own culture here. But what do? I mean, when you have your own culture, you create your own institutions, you create your own hierarchies, you have your own rules, you have your own system. This is just how humans are wired. There is no way to escape this unless you're going to just go live off somewhere in the woods by yourself. But you shouldn't do that either, because that's not good for you. And that's just not going to happen. Like, that's not how we're created to function. I think you see with this past year and dealing with COVID and the restrictions on meeting together and all sorts of things, like people are struggling because we are social creatures. We are meant to be social creatures, and we are meant to be part of social institutions. So this is just how we're created to be. Like, we are made to be part of community. We are made to be part of society. And this is honestly part of the reason why, I believe at least, part of the reason why depression rates have skyrocketed so much is because as society has lost a place for the church, most importantly, but not just the church, but also social clubs, or, having, at one time it was just normal that people are part of like the American Legion, right? You're part of the, DAR or whatever. Like you have these community groups, and you get together with people regularly, and you have a place in that community group, and you have purpose in that group. So this happens both with social organizations, and of course the church being the primary most important one, but kind of especially in the 19th century, when you have people, I mean, I guess starting in the 18th century, but when you have religion having less of a place in public society, people do kind of create more of these social groups because it's just a necessary part of how we function. Now, what we've done in our culture today is we've gotten rid of all of those social groups. We have gotten rid of any sense of local community. There are a lot of reasons why that's happened. One is just transportation. So people move out to the suburbs. They're not living in the city anymore. They're not gathering together in their local place. Now you go to church, 30 minutes away from where you live. We drive 25 minutes to get to the church that we attend too. So, and when I'm preaching at other churches, I drive much farther than that. But this is just the thing that happens. And what that means is now you're divorced from that community. Now there's this gap. So you don't have the immediate community in a way that we're really meant to. And then with the internet, now we have this kind of substitute community where instead of actual in-person conversations, we have these digital connections. And that's why everybody talks about the everything community. Everything is called a community nowadays. Because now your community is just whatever your personal interest is. You find people who have the same interests online and you connect online, and that's your community. Well, it doesn't bring the same kind of joy and fulfillment as an actual in-person community does. I think statistics demonstrate that, but it also is just, I think, demonstrable by experience. Part of the other problem with that is now we've created communities around our particular interests. So it means that we can isolate ourselves from individuals who are unlike us and surround ourselves by people who are like us, meaning people who affirm what we do and feel and think. And now what we've done is we've rejected the social institutions that actually force us to be with people who are around us in our community, who are of different ages, who are of different beliefs, and we are the places where we are actually challenged. So what we do is surround ourselves by the echo chamber. Everybody talks about this. You've got your echo chamber on social media. You have your particular community that you're a part of. And what you do now is when you have your internal feelings or internal desires or internal hurts, instead of having to actually deal with it in community with other people who may differ from you, or who maybe have to deal with the consequences of what your decisions are when they actually harm others, now you have just found a community of people who affirm you and whoever you are and whatever you want to be. And it's very easy to live life that way. And when you do that, you are missing what is the necessary social structure of having expectations that you actually have to fulfill and having to actually improve yourself and having to actually work on things or see what's wrong with yourself. Instead, now we can isolate ourselves in these kind of mini little communities or subcultures or whatever. And we can say, well, we're all the good people and those people over here are the bad people. And so you surround yourself by like-minded people, and now you see everyone else as the enemy. And that's absolutely what we have done in our society, and in our culture today. Because even when you do have a community, say a college, and this is one of the greatest things I think about college is it does actually force people to be in community with other people, and this is why a lot of times when people leave college they really miss it because we don't have social structure and community at all. I mean, you look at people online complaining about how they have no friends because they're 25 and it's impossible to have friends now because you just work and go home and spend time online and there's no place to meet people. That's just how our society is. So college is kind of like this little bit of a break from that where you have community. But even so, we've kind of isolated ourselves in ways that weren't the case in the past. I think if you walk around Cornell here where I am, you just everybody's got their headphones on. It's like everybody ignores, everybody looks at the ground, has their headphones on. Like we have just imbibed this idea that we can just be these individual selves, disconnected, completely atomized, disassociated from everyone else. So society is now the problem. The societal structures are the problem. We are always in the right. And so it means that we can now critique others. So this means that education is not for the purpose of forming people. And there's so much we could say about this, and maybe I'll do a discussion about classical education at some point because I think that's really key. But education, when you see, in a classical approach, education is about the formation of the individual. And this essentially falls apart because we've divorced truth, goodness, and beauty from one another. So truth is just truth. They're just a set of facts. There's no value in truth. And this is one of the complete, kind of incoherent ideas of, well, what is like the new atheism or secularism today is people like Richard Dawkins certainly talk like there's a lot of value in truth, and they're very passionate about it. But from a purely materialistic perspective, you can't actually make a value judgment. There's no coherent way to make a value judgment beyond just personal decision or what you happen to think or what society has happened to say is valuable, but there's no inherent value in it at all. So, but what we recognize this, I think, inherently is that the things that are true are also the things that are good. And what happens, though, is when you divorce those two things, and from beauty as well, which is a key part of this, we have what are a set of facts that you learn at school, and you go to school to fill your head with facts, because truth this is what we call a correspondence theory of truth, that the true is that which corresponds to that which is actually the case. And we try in modern education to have this kind of valueless education system, which essentially just says, well, it's all about just memorizing the facts. It's whatever corresponds to what is the case outside of you. That's what we learn, and that's what education's for. The problem is we're not created to be these like fact machines. We're not created to be, computers. We are not, and this is just not naturally how we're wired. This is just not naturally how we are. We desire things that are good. We desire things that are beautiful. We make value judgments more than we do really truth judgments. Why is it that people get so heated and angry about judgments about media? Because we recognize that beauty is a value. We're deeply concerned about it. We're very concerned about it. I mean, go watch some video essays on The Last Jedi. Just like look at the passion that people have about that movie, on one side or the other, whether they love it or think it's horrible. But people are so passionate because we care about beauty in the art that we like. We want narrative consistency. We care about people argue about music like crazy because we are oriented to far more than just facts. We are oriented to ultimately God. And so when we're oriented to God, because that's naturally what our desires are for, we want things that reflect him. We want things that reflect order. We want things that reflect beauty and goodness. And the role of education should be holistic, right? It should be to form the person, because you're a child. You need to be trained, and you need to be trained in all of these different areas. You don't just need to be trained in what facts are. No, but you need to be developed as a moral person. You need to learn what it is to live a virtuous life. You need to learn what it is to be patient. You need to learn what it is to say no to your internal desires. Like, that's key. That's really key to being a functioning human in society. And as soon as you get rid of that, you've gotten rid of like everything that makes society coherent whatsoever. And that's what we've done. And this is why, here's a great example of just how this has affected all of us, is that if you have a view of what is beautiful, and you say, this is an example of good music, this is not. Say you're trying to demonstrate that Bach is good music, and that, Taylor Swift, whether you think it's good or not for what it is, that's fine. But to say like, Bach is like kind of on a different level than Taylor Swift, right? Like they're not quite the same. Like one has more beauty than the other. Doesn't mean you can't enjoy the one as much as the other, but like there's something inherently better in some way about one than the other, right? And sorry if the Taylor Swift fans are going to start, complaining and yelling at me about this, but what we have done with value judgments or judgments of beauty is we've said that it is purely subjective, right? It's pure subjectivity. And that if you say one kind of thing is better than another, say literature or music, or, if you like I do, I love opera. If you say, opera is beautiful, and I think opera is better than Broadway musicals. Of course you can, depends on the musical, depends on the opera, but you know what I mean? But if you're going to make that judgment, say, right, of some particular opera or whatever, the response is, well, like beauty, it's all subjective. It's whatever you like. You're being elitist if you say something is better than something else. Well, is that true though? Because if God is truth, goodness, and beauty, which I'm saying he is, then we actually do have to be trained. Like, we have to be trained to understand, just as we're trained in understanding of what is true in, say, like, scientific findings or mathematics or anything else, we also do have to be trained to recognize what is good literature. We have to be trained in the particulars of what makes a story good. We have to be trained in the particulars of, like, what makes art good. What is symmetry? What is proportion? We have to be trained in what makes music skilled and beautiful. And we can't just take that away by just subjectivizing all of it and saying, well, it's all equal, it's all the same. Like, it's just not. It's just not. So when our education can't make value judgments at all, and we've said it's all just facts, that's it, you're just learning the facts, well, we can't function that way. Like, that's just not how we're made to be. So if the school then is not, or educational institutions are not outwardly forming us, the inevitable result is, because we all have this internal inherent desire for goodness and beauty and moral formation and these kind of things, because we're created for that. What we're going to do now is, if it's not coming to us, we're going to create it in ourselves and then say that has to come to me, right? That has to align with what I'm thinking and doing and believing. So this is what's happened, and I think it's just the inevitable result. So this is what we're dealing with, is educational institutions now they're institutions in general, but I'm speaking education. But institutions are not about the formation of the individual. They are now platforms of our performance, where we are our authentic selves because we are able to give expression to who we are inside. So it's about self-expression. It's about me being who I truly am. Me being, honest with myself. And the purpose of an institution is for people who can be themselves, all being together and affirming one another in their particular views of the self. And there is no outward formation going on whatsoever, because that is an imposition, and we have all sorts of ways to criticize any kind of formation from the outside, being like whatever phobic that we choose to say. If you say something is right or something is wrong, something I find just really odd, speaking with students here at Cornell University. It's an Ivy League university, and I constantly hear students complaining about elitism and saying, like, well, I don't want to be elitist, and we should do things that are elitist, and accusing other people of being elitist. Like, an Ivy League institution is kind of by definition the elite school. I mean, that's like what the whole thing means. Like, these are the elite schools. Like, this is the elite. You are the elite. Don't try to pretend that you're not. It's like that conversation that Logan has with Rory. If you ever watched Gilmore Girls, which, yes, I know, it's a girly show. I don't care. It's a great show. But where he's like telling her that she's part of this world. You can try to criticize these, upper class people all you want, but like, that's you. This is what the problem with a lot of our kind of the progressive elites is, that they don't recognize themselves as elitists, and they are the elite and are always criticizing things for being elitist. And like, that's actually not helping anybody, because society naturally has these hierarchies. Like, you are going to have those people who are going to shape culture more than others. And the best thing you can do is recognize that position that you're in your culture. Say, if you are at an elite school, right? If you have an elite job, first of all, as a Christian, you know that it doesn't make you any better than anybody else. There's the whole, like, last shall be first and these kind of things. Like, in the kingdom of God, it means nothing. But in terms of the society of the world, like in the kingdom of the left, like, if you do have an elite position, like, you do have unique influence. So recognize that and accept it and do something good with it, right? Like, do something. Somebody made this point to me that I thought was interesting, because it's a question that I've pondered a lot. Is, why is it that, say Donald Trump had such a platform with blue collar people, just ordinary people, when, like, why did they see him as a kind of everyman, or the one who's supporting the everyman, even though he is like elite? I mean, he's extremely wealthy. He's a star on television. Like, there are all of these things about him that just don't make him the everyman, like, at all. That seem like definitional of elite. And someone said to me, and I think this is on Twitter, they just said, I think what people liked about him is that he actually recognized that and didn't hide it. Like, he didn't pretend, oh, I'm just one of you. He just said, hey, this is who I am, but I'm looking out for you. Which, and this is no value judgment on Trump or Trump supporters whatsoever. It's just like a kind of observation of what's going on here. But, I think there's something very much to that, which is people would rather you not pretend to be a Native American when you're not, or something. Just because you can be like, look, I'm oppressed too, which is just like a lie. And an elitist trying to use oppression as a way to like get more power, which seems counterintuitive. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. Yeah, I grew up in Massachusetts, and I'm not a fan of Elizabeth Warren. So sorry, I don't talk about political figures normally, but I think she's a good example of the cultural point I'm trying to make. No comments on policies or anything anything else. So we'll just leave that as it is. Anyway, so I think as we're thinking through like social institutions, when we make it about just the individual experience or affirming the individual, it just is not doable. Like, we create hierarchies, we create institutions, we create positions of power. We can either recognize what's really there or pretend it's not there. And like, let's be honest with the realities, right? So, okay. Now let's move on a little bit to Philip Rieff now, as we're looking here at this second major figure. Now, I have a summary of some of Rieff's thought here from Trueman. He says, culture directs individuals outward. It is greater than, prior to, and formative of the individual. We learn who we are by learning how to conform ourselves to the purposes of the larger community to which we belong. Okay, so there's Trueman's summary of this idea that is in Philip Rieff about culture. So culture is prior to us, and we learn to fit into that culture. We are not more ultimate than culture is, so that we come into culture with this critical eye and say that culture needs to affirm me as who I am. And this is why people are constantly talking about, finding themselves. And we see this in, for example, we see this in a lot of like talks of marriage. Is someone says, well, I would get, I don't want to get married yet because I need to figure out who I am. And, you do all this soul searching or whatever, you get established in your career, and then you're supposedly set on who you are, then you can get married. Well, I think the problem with that, and there are many problems with that, but a large part of the problem is the broader ideology behind that is this idea that there is a self that is divorced from other people. When you go off, hiking by yourself to go find yourself, you're not going to, because there is no isolated self. This is the problem. Yes, you have a soul as an individual. Yes, you stand before God, as an individual, meaning you don't stand before God, in absence of your own faith and say well, I'm part of this community that believes. No, there's personal faith and things like that. But, as Luther would say in the judgment seat of God, it's like we all stand before God on our own. He's not trying to be like a pure individualist in every sense, but he's trying to say when it comes to faith, you have to actually repent. Right? You can't rely on the faith and repentance of your parents or your wife or kids or whatever. You got to do it yourself. Okay, so as we're thinking about this, your place in society, as Luther would say, we speak about our righteousness coram mundo, before others. Your identity in the world, right? You have your baptized identity as a child of God, which is secured and sealed forever, and then you have that identity in the church among other children of God who are also baptized. But your identity in the world, or coram mundo, before others, is shaped by your social place. It is. That's just the reality. It's shaped by your life experiences. It's shaped by your parents, how you were raised. It's shaped by the language you speak. It's shaped by the people that you were around. And that identity does, shift. It shifts depending on where you are in life. Your identity as you are as an adult should be different from your identity as a kid. It should be. It's not for everybody, but that's part of our problem. Another problem in our culture is we don't want to grow up because we grab onto our identity as the things that we enjoy and think that we have to kind of hold on to that and not move on in life. But that's kind of a discussion for another day. So our identity or our self isn't isolated. And this is why when people try to find themselves, they don't. I mean, why is it that, I mean, this is just statistically the case. You know, Zoomers have more mental health issues than previous generations. Like they statistically they do. And this just kind of keeps increasing with mental health issues. Now, to be fair, I do think some of that is that there's more talk about mental health issues. Probably at one time there was not, there was social pressure to kind of not say that you had mental health issues. So I think that actually plays a significant role in it as well. But along with that, I think it's undoubted that rates of depression and just other mental health issues keep increasing. And the more that culture shifts into this mode of you are who you are internally, the more depressed people are. Like, because this is not how we're supposed to function. It's never been how we function. So instead, we need a culture. We have a place within that culture. We have a place within our community. We have a place within our own societies. And we need to fit into that. Now, it doesn't mean there's no place for individuality. You know, like this doesn't mean, by the way, that like there's no such thing as self-expression, or there's no such thing as individuality, or we should have a culture where, you know, it's like THX 1138. If you've ever seen that movie, everybody's like wearing white outfits and their heads are shaved, they're all identical. You know, we're not talking about this like dystopian force everyone to be the same kind of thing. But we do have to have like this anchor in our social positions. And when that anchor is gone and all you're left with is your internal state and your self-expression, we really don't have stability or structure. And we end up with depression, essentially. So another thing that Rieff comes up with, which, you know, with Trueman cites here, that I think is very helpful, is that Rieff distinguishes between 4 states of man, or kind of how we view ourselves. Now, as Trueman acknowledges, this is always going to be simplistic. Anytime you try to divide history in this kind of very neat way, like it's going to be simplistic. So, you know, I mentioned this before. If you say like, well, there was no such thing as like the internal, you know, psychological self until, you know, the modern era, like that's just not true. I mean, you read Luther, but you also go back and read Augustine, and or if you look at someone like Christopher Stendhal, who I think I mentioned last time too, you know, he's got Paul and the introspective conscience in the West. Like, well, no one was introspective until Augustine or Luther. I mean, he isn't quite sure which one, but that's not true either. Like, this is part of the human experience. But what we do have are shifts, like shifts in emphasis, shifts in how we primarily see ourselves, how we orient ourselves to the world, how we orient ourselves to others, our patterns of thought. So I do think that Rieff's, well, it's generalized and it's not hard and fast. I think that he does grab onto something real here, that there are generally these kinds of shifts at different periods in history. And he talks about the 4 types of man. He says, first there's political man, and he cites, you know, Plato and Aristotle there. So we're talking about ancient Greece, where we are kind of defined by our place in the polis, in the city, in the location where we are, with the society that we're in. We're part of various social institutions. Cultures have various hierarchies. Certain families are more important than others, right? You've got the kings and queens, or you have the nobility, or you have the peasants, or you have the servants, or whatever. In a lot of societies, you're born into that. That's your place, and you live according to that. So you're defined in many ways in terms of your obligations, in your duties, where you're born, who you're born with. And there isn't a lot of kind of societal mobility at that point. Of course, that ends up shifting very much so. And by the way, I don't think that's all bad, that we have like the ability to move outside of one very narrow thing. But it certainly is something that does shift. So we have to recognize that life is very different in that era. Everything's kind of set up for you. You just are, well, who you're born to be. You're born in that particular place, in that particular society. Okay, so then we have in the medieval world what he calls religious man. Now our identity is our place in the church and our place as, a baptized Christian and your role in the church. And the church becomes itself the center of the community. So you have an identity that is very anchored because your identity is there in your religious community. And that's true even regardless of someone's personal faith and repentance internally in some ways. Like everyone's defined by their place in the church in the medieval period in the West in one way or another. Then you have economic man, which he talks about as something that is very kind of brief because it can't last. It just by its nature can't last very long. So, and you see this with the rise of capitalism, and then you have Marxism as a response to capitalism, where we are largely thinking of ourselves in economic terms. So this is something that just it certainly is the case. I've currently been reading through Jane Austen's novels, and I want to get through all of them. But it's one of these themes that you see in the early 19th century is like, and she's clearly criticizing this throughout her writings, but everyone is defined by money. I mean, like everything is defined by how much money you have. Should you marry somebody? Your family only wants you to marry somebody if they have, status, but largely also just money. And then you see this as well coming into the United States, especially kind of getting into the late 19th century as well. You have a society that is largely dependent on money and who has the money. And you have people doing things like, the gold rush. Everybody moves to California because they think there's money there. And you have the rise of these major figures that own such a huge percentage of the wealth in the United States. So we do define ourselves in that era largely, and again, not exclusively, but largely through money, through our economic situation, which is why Marxism has such an influence, because people are seeing themselves in terms of money. So Marx's idea of economic oppression and the way that he formulates the proletariat and the bourgeoisie and all of this, it fits very well within the kind of economic mindset that people have. What happens then is you shift from those three past ways of viewing humanity into what is the psychological man. We define ourselves by our personal psychology, by our inner desires, by our inner feelings. And this is very much how we view ourselves today. I mean, why do you think everybody loves the Enneagram so much today? Because that's how we define ourselves. Like, we literally define ourselves by, this is who I am. I have these internal traits. These are my internal fears. These are my internal desires. That's just how we think about ourselves today. And to some degree, like, we can't just avoid that because that's the case. That's how we think of ourselves. That's how our society views itself. But we have to be aware of that. And say that this is not how previous societies have viewed themselves. Like, this is a new way of looking at ourselves. So we do have this shift to inner psychology. And that very much is how we think about ourselves today, as opposed to in these other things. Now, what we've done is now we've kind of totally erased all of the things that are external to us. And now we're left with only that which is internal to us. When you get rid of religion in society, you get rid of just your place in broader culture or politics. You get rid of the economic ideas and economic positions. Whether those things are good or not is irrelevant. The point is, and obviously I would say, the religious man is certainly who we should be. I'm a theologian after all. But regardless of what you think about those things, it is just objectively the case that all of the external things are gone, and now we're left internally. Like, we are defining ourselves solely by our internal states. And it's not good. It's not healthy. It's not the way that society functions. It's not the way that culture functions. And it's unsustainable. Like, it's unsustainable in terms of our own mental health. And this is kind of the irony of it is we think that we're taking care of our mental health by caring about our internal states so much. But because we're not now oriented toward the other, we're oriented toward the self and our inner psychological states. We're not actually functioning in a way that is good for us psychologically. So we just get more and more depressed. The reality is, like, we are made and created to have an external desire and focus. Like, we are to be focused on the good of others. Love your neighbor as yourself. The entire message of Jesus in terms of how we are to live in this world is to be oriented toward the other, not the self. And as Augustine says, we are by nature incurvatus se. So this psychological man plays into what is our natural state. But in a lot of ways, the more we are oriented toward others, first of all, we're doing what we're supposed to do. Like, we're functioning as we're supposed to function. So it does bring about delight. And it doesn't mean just temporary pleasure like we do when we're kind of pleasuring our inner desires, but real fulfillment, which is not always pleasant in the moment. But real internal fulfillment is when we are doing what we are called to do, which is looking to the other. And when we're looking to the other, we're serving the other. We're not actually looking at ourselves and then worried about our psychological state all the time. Because the more you're looking at yourself and worried about your psychological state, the more you get more depressed and the more things just kind of get worse. So it ends up not being helpful as much as we think we are taking care of ourselves. It actually ends up having exactly the opposite effect. Now, Rieff also has this other distinction that I think is really important here. That there are, and this will be the last point that I make because I know I'm running out of time here, but is that we have basically these three cultural worlds, right? If we're going to look at the history of culture, the history of humanity as we have it written, Rieff kind of defines it in this way. He says there is, the first world, which is the world of paganism. We see that society itself is organized by this pantheon of gods. And the pantheon of gods, whether this is like the Greek gods or, Norse mythology or whatever, I mean, there is this pantheistic notion that is pretty common in the ancient world. So we have societies that are organized in terms of the order of the gods. Now, that sacred order, or the ordering of the gods, stands behind societal order and grounds societal order in something other than itself, or something transcendent, something outside of itself. And this means that now the state or authorities, hierarchies in society are to be grounded upon that external source, which is the gods, right? So now those gods give a foundation for the structure of society, the moral center of society, the kind of the culture of society. Then we have what he calls the second world, which is monotheism. So he's talking about the Jewish world or Christian world or Islamic world, where now we have this shift from these many gods to a god, a transcendent god, being the grounding that founds society and its structure. So you have a shift from the first to the second, and here let me give an example of how that's the case. If you look at, say, ancient Egypt, or you look at ancient Rome, the emperor or pharaoh is a kind of divine figure. So within a kind of first world system or pantheistic system, you have a like leader who is themselves divine to some degree, right? When you move then to the monotheistic system, you still do have a transcendent structure for the government, but it's not nearly as absolute, right? It's not this, well, they are gods who do what they say, but it is that there is this transcendent God behind them, and we understand scripturally that like God takes leaders down and raises leaders up and puts whoever he wants into place. The emperor then has both a divine authority as a servant of God, as you read like Romans 13, they have a transcendent authority behind them. So we obey the emperor because we understand God, something real behind that. But also the emperor themselves has accountability to God. Like they do have accountability. They can't just do whatever they want. They're not just this deity by themselves, but they have this transcendent law they've got to listen to. Then we have, though, what he calls the third world, which is the secular world, where there are no gods at all. And essentially what we have is there is no sacred order that is the grounding for social order. And that throws out the entire function and basis of society itself. And that's what we're left with. If there is no sacred order, there is no social order. You cannot have these two things totally divorced from each other. And why liberalism even worked at all for the time that it has, and I think it's showing itself not to really work, but for the time that liberalism has worked, it's worked because we have those Christian assumptions underneath it that are just kind of unspoken, and they're part of our cultural consciousness in the West, but we don't realize it. And I made this comment before that even like Marxism and the system of thinking about the oppressed as having this value, like that Marxism, as much as it was, Marx himself set up as Christian as an anti-Christian system because, religion is like the opiate of the masses or whatever. Marxism could only arise in a Christian framework because it's also working on Christian assumptions of the value of the poor and oppressed. I saw Richard Spencer going on like some rant against Christianity because of that. Like he's like, hey, they're just like the Marxist because they don't see like power as the ultimate good, and we should care for the poor and oppressed, and those horrible things. But even though Marx obviously was anti-Christian, he's still even using Christian assumptions to get there, unrecognized. And what happens is that broader social consciousness that we have, eventually, those Christian foundations are going to erode. So while they're still there, you have a lot of still societal order. But eventually, since that sacred order is gone, you don't have anything holding society together. And the farther we move away from that, the farther we're going to be from having any cohesive structure whatsoever. And that's just where we are as a culture today. So, that's the end of my discussion here on Trueman's work. I have so many other things that I could say. I didn't get into I got to most of what I wanted to talk about. I didn't talk about this idea of the death work, which I think is also important. But I also didn't talk about what Trueman says is essentially the creating of the modern world has, he says, basically 3 steps to it. One is the psychologizing of the self. The second is the sexualizing of psychology, and the third is the politicizing of sex. And maybe I'll do, if you want, let me know if you want to do another program on this, because I could do a third program kind of walking through that as well. I hope you found this somewhat useful, and I know it's kind of outside of what I usually talk about, but I just think it's important. And what I don't want to do is, I don't want to be one of these like kind of doom and gloom, the world is ending kind of things. That's not like what I desire to do at all. But I also think as Christians, first of all, like we have optimism. I mean, we are part of the kingdom of God. This is an eternal kingdom. Like Christ is seated on the throne. We shouldn't be that worried about, what's going on in our culture, society, as if it collapses or whatever. I mean, well, ultimately, what does it matter? Eternally, it doesn't matter. Christ wins. Like he's on the throne. So there's no place for just this like fear all the time. Like the fear mongering stuff, I just think is not helpful. As Christians, we have like eternal hope. We're part of an eternal kingdom. So like in some ways, it doesn't really matter. Like what's the worst thing that's going to happen? If society went totally down the drain and became as bad as it could possibly be, and they're lining up Christians and shooting all of us, which like isn't going to happen right now. But say if it did, right? Worst case scenario. So what? Like we get to be with Jesus. Like who cares? I mean, like we don't have to live in fear, but we do live in this world. So we've got to understand where we're coming from. So I think this stuff is helpful. It's helpful for us to say like, this is our moment. This is where we are. Not to like panic and freak out. You're a baptized child of God. You're an eternal king. You're in an eternal kingdom. That's what really matters. But we are, for however long we're here, we're part of this temporal kingdom as well. And we're called to interact with it. We're called to live in it. And insofar as we're doing that, we need to understand where the ideas of our world, where the ideas of our time, of our age are. And I think that Trueman's book is really helpful in getting us to do that. So hopefully this gave you some things to kind of contemplate and think through. And I will see you in the next program. God bless.